And now it's time for a couple of things that are on my mind, and this is week 102 of me doing this as a full-time occupation, and I am once again concerned about the future of Patreon, more so now than ever before, especially because the CEO is telling CNBC that the business model is not sustainable. Yes, the business model that a lot of creators depend upon for their living, the CEO is saying is not a sustainable model moving forward. He's citing a lot of growth in not only the number of people contributing, but the amount of money they are paying out. It looks like they are up 1 million new patrons over the last year, people paying into other creators. And he's also saying the company is on track to pay out $500 million, about $500 million to creators in the coming year as a result of that growth, and that is no longer sustainable in his words. This prompted a number of users to respond, and this tweet got the attention of the Patreon CEO. Dan Olson here says that the Patreon as the corporate entity has come to see its core product, the payment processing, as a burden, a loss leader that they've used to get you into the store, and now they're going to figure out how to get you to open your wallet up for better margins. And I think this actually speaks more to some bad business practices on the part of the company from the get-go that are bringing us to the point that we are at now. This tweet actually got the CEO to start talking, and there was a whole Twitter thread that you can find at the URL you see on screen. Conti says that startups require capital to keep up with their users. They're now serving over 100,000 creators, which is surprisingly low in my opinion. I would expect there to be more. And 3 million patrons of those creators. He said they are requesting literally thousands of features from us, everything from fulfilling merchandise to team accounts to new currency support. And this got me to thinking, how many of these 100,000 creators are actually demanding all of these features versus just using Patreon as a payment processor? I know I use it as a payment processor primarily. I also know that everyone I support on Patreon is largely using it for that as well. Occasionally they'll post something to say, hey, check out this patron-only thing, a little preview video or something like that. But by and large, it is a payment processor for most of the people that I support. And I would imagine probably most of the 100,000 out there are also using it just for that. Again, the core business model here. And if you think about the fact that they're going to be paying out $500 million, that means Patreon's gross profit here is going to be approximately $25 million this year. Now, this, of course, is the gross profit before expenses and employees and all the other things that they have to pay out. But still, a $25 million gross profit for 100,000 customers is actually, I think, a pretty good business. If you weren't tied up with a bunch of venture capital, which Patreon is tied up with here. So they've taken well over $100 million in venture capital money. This is not a loan, but these are investors who, in exchange for giving the company money, take a good chunk of the company in exchange in the hopes that the company will get sold maybe to Google or to Facebook or Twitch or something, and they can all cash out when the company sells for $1 billion or something. But right now, they don't have a $1 billion business. They have a very sustainable business for what they do, but they're not finding success trying to expand the profit-making potential here, and this is the roadblock that Patreon is currently facing. The business is actually very sustainable, but it's not sustainable given the fact that Jack Conti got into bed with all these venture capitalists who are demanding more and more out of the company in order to get that company sold so they can recoup their investment. Now, having all this venture capital money led to some pretty poor decisions. Because they didn't have to worry about what things cost, they just kept rolling out features when users requested them, irrespective of how many people wanted those features. So when they put together their payment options, they have added a couple of different ways in which people can support their creators. Now, if I remember correctly, the per creation option here was the first thing that they offered. So what that means is that as a YouTube creator, I could say to all of you, every time I post a new YouTube video, I'm going to charge you whatever you pledged for that video. So for example, if you say, I'll pay you $1 for every episode, and I did 5 episodes that month, then you would be paying $5 at the end of the month. Basically, it would bundle up all those pledges and charge the credit cards at the end of the month there. Now, I didn't like that per creation option because I produce so much content. I figured it would be easier for people just to pledge a monthly amount and then have that charge out at the end of the month. So that's what I went with, and that was a good option that they added. And one of the cool things about how Patreon works is that they bundle the charges together. So let's say you're giving $1 to me and $1 to 9 other creators. They'll charge you $10 and not $1 10 times. And that's a significant savings on fees because if somebody just gives me a credit card and I charge them $1, about 30 cents or so goes to the credit card processor as part of their fixed rate transaction fee. And then there's also a percentage that's taken off the total amount. So when you give $1, a large percentage of that contribution goes to credit card fees. And what Patreon did by bundling these things together at a set time of the month was that you can actually get a little less of a fee charged on that $1 contribution because that 30-cent fee is applied to the $10 that you contributed versus having 30 cents coming out of every dollar you contributed. I did a whole video on the math here, which I'll link to down below, which goes into more detail. But this is really the strength of Patreon, was that bundling and making microtransactions a little bit more profitable for the creators because there conceivably could be less fees charged on those small contributions from people who contribute to many creators. But then they got a lot of people asking for more things here, and they added a new thing called charge up front, where they would charge the patron the minute that they made a pledge for immediate access. But here's the thing. This was probably not requested by a majority of their patron people out there. It was probably a smaller percentage of the total. And they didn't charge extra for this service, which I think they probably should have done. Granted, it would have created some friction, but nonetheless, it cost them more to do this because now they've got a whole different thing that they have to account for when they're charging not at the end of the month, but in the middle of the month whenever people are signing up for something. And you can imagine how complex this gets the more people start contributing to charge upfront patrons. And this led to some really poor decisions that Patreon made. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of when their last funding round came through. So in September of 2017, they got close to $60 million from a venture capital fund. And then less than 2 months later, they're changing their fee structure. And this almost blew up the entire Patreon system because what they wanted to do was get rid of that bundling, that aggregation, because people were doing charge up front and it was getting so confusing for them and they were spending a lot of man hours trying to figure out how to bill out all these fees. So in their infinite wisdom, they decided the best way to handle this was to just take the fee structure and put it onto the people contributing. So they would charge you the service fee. And then because they were getting rid of the aggregation, if you were contributing $10 to 10 creators, $1 each, you would be spending now 30 plus cents per creator in fees. So your $10 contribution would go up substantially just to pay these credit card fees out. And that was their solution. And if you read the article that they posted talking about how wonderful this idea is, you wonder what planet they were on. I'm looking at this on vacation thinking this is going to be a disaster. And sure enough, it was a disaster. While I'm sitting there on my front porch enjoying my coffee, I saw the blog article. I then went over to my Patreon account and I was losing patron after patron, many saying, I'm sorry, Lon, but this is just ridiculous. I can't justify these costs to continue contributing to so many different creators. And I didn't blame them. So I had to really hustle to find some other solution. Now, serial entrepreneur Jason Calacanis, who does a lot of angel investing into startups, makes a good point here. He's saying that the business model really is difficult, and he heard no less than 20 pitches over the last couple of years for a better Patreon, but none have really come about. It's a very challenged model, which is why Patreon is under so much pressure from their investors, because the model is so challenging to scale up to $1 billion operation, given the constraints that they're in. But again, if they were focused on running a good business, they would have said, look, this charge upfront thing is a big convenience to these creators. We need to charge a higher fee because of the cost it's going to be for us to offer that feature. There's a carriage cost here for creators that are doing more, and they probably should charge more. Now, there are examples of this in the industry. So the Square credit card processor, for example, will send your money to you for free in 1 to 2 business days after they take out their transaction fees. But if you want your money right this second, you can pay a percentage of what they owe you, and they will get it to you right now. They obviously had a lot of requests from customers for this, and they looked at what it would cost to implement that feature, and they charge a fee for that convenience. There's nothing wrong with that, especially when it goes above and beyond the core functionality of the product. I don't see any issue with this, and I don't know why Patreon didn't start charging for this kind of feature and other features that they've been implementing and hustling over that I think probably a very small percentage of their overall patron base actually uses. And as a result of this, we're all going to suffer when the company goes kaput or has to find some way to make more money because they got themselves into a model that is completely unsustainable. Now, I've talked about this in the past, but this is an example of doing the payment processing correctly. And if you are using Patreon primarily as a payment processor and want to diversify, I've had a lot of good experiences so far with DonorBox. This is a service that will do monthly contributions, or it will do one-time contributions. They basically charge based on when the person contributes for the first time. So if somebody goes on to DonorBox and pledges $10, it'll charge them $10 right away, and then 30 days later, a month later, essentially, they'll charge the next $10. It supports PayPal and Apple Pay and Stripe and everything else. And what's nice is that they don't run the payment processing themselves. They have you sign up for a Stripe account and a PayPal account, and they basically collect the data and send it over to those payment processors. So they were smart about this. They decided not to build their own payment processing system from scratch. They're going to send you over to something that works just fine. It's very easy to get everything connected, and they don't have to maintain any of that, nor have to worry about any of the security issues that come into play with collecting credit card information. Because don't forget, Patreon also got hacked a little while ago, and some of that user information was compromised. This stuff is completely not stored on the DonorBox servers, and the pricing on this is pretty reasonable also. So if you are under $1,000 in contributions a month, you have no charges from DonorBox at all. It's completely free to use. You do have to pay your credit card transaction fees, of course, and those get taken out directly by PayPal or Stripe. Now, if you go over $1,000 a month, they charge you 1.5% of what you brought in as a service fee, which I think is very reasonable, especially when you look at Patreon, which charges you 5% on top of your credit card fees. Now, of course, there is some efficiency with Patreon if you give to me and 10 other creators, but I'm finding after using DonorBox now for almost 2 years that it's about a wash here. Yes, some contributions have a little bit more in fees taken out by the credit card processor versus Patreon, but Patreon's fee takes a lot of that out as well. So it really, this for me has been pretty much a wash here and not a bad way to go with an alternative. One other thing to look at is that they have been adding features that users have been requesting, and they're charging for those features because they are running a sustainable business here. So if you want to integrate automatically with MailChimp, for example, it's $8 a month. If you don't want to pay the $8 a month, then export your list and do it yourself. Not that hard to do. They also have some employer gift matching here for $40 a month and Salesforce integration for $50 a month. And they looked at this probably saying, well, we've got a small percentage of our users looking for these additional features. Here's what it's going to cost to implement and maintain those. Let's charge a fair price for that. And I'm sure that those who need those features are willing to pay. As for me, it's a payment processor. I'm not paying anything, and I'm perfectly happy here. If I wanted those features, I would pay for them, and I think that's pretty reasonable. Now, the developers of this application are not some VC-backed thing. They are a development house that makes applications for other companies. I did a lot of research on these guys when I was putting together my decision to use DonorBox, and they've got a few other apps that are sustaining some income for them as well, that are really simple things that are working for them and not going above and beyond what they can afford to make happen. And you can see more on their website there. But this is really, I think, the difference between doing something correctly and building a sustainable business versus this notion of, well, we've got unlimited cash, so let's just spend it and see where we end up. Well, now we're at where they ended up, and I think a lot of creators might get hurt because of it. So what I would suggest, if you are relying on Patreon, is to start looking for alternatives. I hope YouTube makes their membership program a little bit more attractive. Right now, they take too much and there aren't any tiering options and whatnot. Donor Box, though, I found to be a really good option, and something that if you are looking for a simple payment processor is definitely something you should look at, and then look at maybe going to email or some other thing to try to communicate out with people that are contributing, because there are better options out there that cost less. And I think we all need to be prepared for perhaps an eventual shutting down of Patreon or a degradation in their service to the point where it becomes too expensive to use.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Chris Allegretta, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, Tom Albrecht, Anuj Zaveri, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.